I'd like to welcome you all to this Transportation Group Conference Highlights webinar. We held our conference in March, so not that long ago. It was very good timing before all of this new world that we're in. We had 200 people attend the conference, which was fantastic, and we were able to showcase some amazing things happening down here in Christchurch. The theme this year was equity in transport, and that went really well. The speakers all diligently weaved that theme into their presentations. And today we have 3 presenters. These people have won prizes or awards that we give out in the conference for either the presentation or papers. We have another 3 presentations lined up that we've kind of got sitting on the back burner. We wanted to see how successful today was. And we're getting quite a lot of interest, so I think we will run another one of these in a couple of weeks. There's quite a lot of webinars going on at the moment, so we don't want to webinar overload everyone, but I think everyone's enjoying the opportunity to keep up their CPD and engage in these remote times. So today's first speaker is Nick Lovett. Nick is a senior policy planner at the Christchurch City Council. Nick's award at the conference was for his soapbox presentation, which was a fairer way toward transport pricing. I'm going to hand over to Nick now. Nick will then introduce Elaine, and Elaine will introduce Lewis. Holly from ENZ is doing all the stuff in the background, and if you have any issues, please post some questions and we'll help you with those. And also, as you're listening to the presenters, please post your questions for them, because they will answer the questions relating to their talk directly after their presentation. Thank you and enjoy.
Cool, thanks. Thanks very much, Jeanette. Can everyone hear me? Getting thumbs up. Cool, thanks, Jeanette. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, and like Jeanette said, this was a soapbox presentation. So this was based on a sort of a think piece paper, and this was the first time in the conference history recently we've sort of had this think piece available. So this is based on a policy paper I wrote for a summer school paper last year. So I was very interested in exploring this idea around how we fund transport, and can there be a fairer way of doing it? Can we get fairer outcomes? But before we dive into what some of these fairer alternatives might look like, it's kind of helpful to think about how we define fairness and what we mean by fairness when we talk about transport policy. So often there's 3 aspects to consider. We think about who decides, who pays and benefits, and then sort of how and how much we should be paying. So when thinking about who decides, there's process equity and social equity. In process equity, we think about how do we prioritise the transport projects? Does the squeaky wheel always get the grease? Is that a mechanism that's driving a lot of our decision making? And social equity, the proportion to which, the extent to which allocation is proportionate to need. And it's interesting to think about some examples around this, and I sort of thought about the Simpsons episode with the monorail. Did a town of 20,000 people really need a monorail, and how did they decide about building it? And it was a catchy show tune. So the decision making behind funding what projects we decide to fund is a big part of it, but it's often overlooked. The second part about who pays and who benefits, we think about market equity or the benefit principle. Are the beneficiaries paying into it? Is there an exacerbator aspect as well? Do a particular group cause any harm, and does that need to be rectified? And then within that equity lens, there's also this intergenerational equity. And so this is useful to think about when we think about very big or very long-lasting transport projects like the Auckland Harbour Bridge. Finally, how much should we pay is a really how much should we pay is really challenging one as well, we need to think about horizontal equity, treating sort of people that are similar the same, and vertical equity. Do people that can afford to pay more need to pay more for those that can't? And I think as part of this conversation, we could think about efficiency as well. Is it particularly hard to collect revenue? And that's kind of what the system we have at the moment. It's very, very easy to collect fuel tax revenue, and that's largely how we fund a lot of transport projects today. So diving into that, the status quo, how does the transport funding system work at the moment? Most of us will be broadly familiar with it. We have the National Land Transport Fund, which pulls a lot of funding from various sources, which then feeds the National Land Transport Program, which is a kind of an agreed list of activities that are undertaken that are both funded from the NLTF but also funded from a local contribution. And so, although the local contribution is small, these are city councils and territorial authorities undertaking a lot of this work. It's an aspect that doesn't often get thought about. So just wanted to explore that a little bit more as well. I think there's an overarching perception that our funding system is a user pays system, and that's because such a huge proportion of funds come from fuel taxes. So we sort of inevitably think it's a user pay system, but again, we don't think about on the local side of things, where does that funding come from? And it might be surprising to think about, local roads don't seem like they carry a lot of volume on our network, but they carry more than half. But they don't receive a huge amount of NLTF funding. A lot of this stuff comes from property rates. So that can lead to some unintended consequences and some problems as well. Those problems, I think, come back to this, this fairness question around how we decide and where the money goes and how we're collecting and that sort of thing. If more and more of our transport projects are funded out of sort of general property rates and property taxes and things, we inevitably end up transferring public subsidies to motorists, which kind of distorts the value or the willingness to pay we place on a lot of these transport investments. So we don't know how much people value them. We can tend to overconsume. We end up with the tragedy of commons. That's basically traffic congestion, and in most cases in the transport world, that often leads to cries for more investment, and then the sort of vicious cycle begins to start. So I was thinking about this and thinking, there's possibly a problem here that needs intervention, and I was sort of thinking about how we ended up here. Why did we end up with this transport funding paradigm that we have? And it didn't always used to be like this. Back in the day, a lot of transport projects relied more heavily on kind of more user pays type funding. There was more ways to gather revenue through tyre taxes as well as fuel taxes and things. And there were a lot more toll gates. And this is, when cars were becoming popular pre-war. And then something kind of interesting, I think, happened in the middle part of last century when post-war, the automobile became sort of the dominant transport paradigm. And often this idea about these specific group of beneficiaries or these motorists that should be paying to use these roads, that they became to comprise a much larger proportion of the electorate. So I think somewhere in the middle of the last century, we began to conflate the motorist with the general public, and I think that led to this idea of everyone is benefiting from the transport system because the price of fuel taxes, which are hypothecated, embed themselves in by way of consumer goods and things like that. So we began to sort of fund the transport system like this for the last sort of half a century or more. But also tolls kind of re-emerged towards the end of last century as a necessary way of funding these large transport projects, thinking about the Auckland Harbour Bridge and the Littleton Tunnel. But because the motorist became such a large part of the electorate, they became very political, and tolls were a very, very political thing the later part of last century. So we've ended up with this system. Are there options and alternatives? Are there better ways, fairer ways to fund transport? I think there probably are. We're sort of familiar with some of them. New Zealand doesn't rely a lot on these alternative mechanisms. The toll roads that we have are for helping bring forward projects or fund projects. They're not really there to manage demand or mitigate these problems or tragedy of the commons that we see. But overseas, cordon pricing is becoming more talked about. There's good examples from Stockholm and London where that's been successfully implemented. And then more recently, this idea of electronic road user pricing, time of day pricing is being talked about a lot. There's a lot of advocacy groups talking about replacing road user charges and fuel excise duties with, kind of GPS per day, per kilometre pricing. And really that does hold a lot of promise, I think, for resulting in a fairer transport system where, think about who the beneficiaries and exacerbators are and being able to sort of change behaviour through those pricing mechanisms. It's also probably suits New Zealand very well. It's got a very kind of nationalistic look at how we fund and prioritise transport programs. But a lot of the literature and thinking about alternative funding mechanisms doesn't really look at the local level. And so coming back to the problem around how do local governments fund their proportion of the local share of these transport projects, because they seem set to rely on rates for the foreseeable future. That's where I think there's a really strong case for workplace parking levies. And what I was looking at there was in Nottingham in the UK. They've had a lot of success with this. So you sort of charge a levy on each employer provided space. In New Zealand, it would correct an existing tax distortion. It would drive a lot of behaviour. And just some back of the envelope numbers, looking at the household travel survey and household travel survey engineers at work. What kinds of, what quantum of funding will we talk about here when we look at the major centres? And it's not insignificant for places like Christchurch or Auckland that have high single occupant vehicle use, lots of people that park at work. These could be funding substantial proportions of the transport operating budgets, and they'll stop sort of socialising the costs. So I didn't conclude with a sort of a next best analysis or what the answer is. I sort of wanted to just provoke the discussion, talk about alternatives. not be afraid to try build support for alternatives. There's been a lot of success overseas. So yeah, that's sort of broadly the thrust of my paper and the presentation. So keen to hear any questions, and always keen to talk about this. Thank you. Questions. No questions. Well, if there's no questions, I'll sort of wait a bit more. We can move into our next presentation. Jeanette? Oh. Question here. Question is, CCC has 2.2 billion in debt currently listed on its accounts. Presumably a significant proportion of this debt has been raised to fund prior roading improvements, maintenance and staff. Any future funding expected through debt, and what issues does this raise? So I suppose debt funding is a sensible alternative or approach when thinking about this intergenerational equity. So thinking about the lifespan of a transport asset, and so capital borrowing for capital for transport projects is something that's done. It's done to kind of smooth the program of spending, so property rates don't bounce up and down from year to year. I think the challenge we have with thinking about debt as a solution and sort of large capital projects as a solution for funding transport is the inevitable operating cost that comes with it as well. So building a lot of big transport assets or borrowing through debt to fund them can work. It's a workable solution, but there is sort of this this inevitable operating cost that's going to need to be met, and that cost often isn't met through borrowing. So you mentioned sort of staff in the question, that's funded through operating costs, year to year funding. It's not funded through borrowing, and to some extent that's kind of how the national system works as well. We have a pay as you go model, so it's only through public-private partnerships and alternative funding arrangements that large projects from NZTO use debt. So I think the sort of the ongoing OPEX associated with the borrowing is more of a problem rather than the borrowing itself. So I think there's also something about making clever investments. Cool. So those are a good question. Appreciate that. Next up in our presenter list is Elaine Chen. So Elaine is a urban designer with Beca, and she's presenting on the Te Tupu Ngaitahi design framework. This presentation won Best Abstract Only presentation at the conference, and I'll hand it over to Elaine.
Hi everyone, just checking that everyone can see my slides. Thumbs up? Nope, yes? Yep, okay, perfect. Kia ora everyone. I am part of the Supporting Growth Alliance, Te Tupu Ngātahi. Te Tupu Ngātahi is the largest planning and transport alliance in Australasia. And today I wanted to talk to you about, I guess, the innovative ways that we've been working within the Alliance, and in particular, the design framework that we have put together. I'll just go to the next slide. Sorry, my mouse is having issues. So I guess setting the scene, this is a picture of Auckland under lockdown. Level 3, only a few people allowed out. I guess the Alliance is formed to deal with the population growth over the next 30 years in Auckland, which is estimated to be up to 1 million people, with over 400,000 new homes and about 300,000 new jobs. And I guess the big question that came out of that was, where are we going to put all these people, and how are we going to move all of these people around through the network that we have now, which we don't. Within the Auckland Unitary Plan, 15,000 hectares of land, mostly rural, were identified for future urbanisation. That's about 1.5 times the size of urban Hamilton, which is massive. The 4 areas that were identified in Greater Auckland were Warkworth, North, Northwest and South Auckland. And in 2017, the Alliance was formed to investigate, plan, deliver at a very high level transport networks that are needed to connect these urban growth areas. I guess the transport networks were focused on sort of safety, providing accessibility, livability, travel choice, mode shift, and impact on the environment. And the Alliance is made up of, I guess, a partnership between Waka Kotahi, Beca, Commute, Auckland Transport, ACOM, and Buddle Finley and Balgully, who are both law firms, and our partners are Kiwi Rail, Auckland Council, and Mana Whenua. And the Alliance is made up of a number of different disciplines, from engineers, transport planners, and legal team, urban designers, landscape architects, ecologists, archaeologists, everything under the sun that you can imagine in terms of a collaboration of designers. So the role of the Alliance was to guide the transport investment and facilitate that integration of land use and transport and the future thinking about how these transport networks develop. So in 2018, 4 IBCs were completed for the 4 growth areas. So the IBC stands for Indicative Business Cases. And these are the 4 growth areas that I spoke about earlier: North, Warkworth, Northwest, and South. And so I'll just talk very quickly through the new growth areas, and starting with Warkworth. In 2046, the population of Warkworth is anticipated to increase from around 5,000 people to 22,000. So what the transport networks we're looking at are public transport interchanges, arterials with bus priorities and active modes. In the northwest, which consists of Whenuapai, Red Hills, Kumeu, Huapai, and Riverhead, the population is going to increase from 9,000 to 94,000, which is absolutely huge. The transport networks that would be looking at is an RTN, a ferry interchange, again some arterials with bus priority and active modes. And going towards the north, a population increase from 6,000 to about 100,000 people, consisting of Wainui, Silverdale, Dairy Flat, and looking at transport network that covers an RTN corridor, high frequency bus route, arterials with bus lane priority and active modes. And then lastly, the biggest, growth area, South Auckland, from 85,000 people to 200,000 people. The areas consist of Te Kanini, Opaheki, Drury, Pairata, and Pukekohe. And the key to unlocking South Auckland is looking at the foretracking of the rails, new stations, FTN routes, bus lane priorities, and active modes again. So I guess tackling such a complex design issue that we're facing in fitting all of these people and these networks in this very constrained areas, we kind of developed this design framework, which is a principles-based framework providing integration and outcome guidance from a transport planning perspective. This facilitates an integration of disciplines, the integration of land use and transport, integration and application of design principles. It's a collaboration. The design framework was a collaboration between the Alliance's disciplines and a lot of the active mode specialists. And how it works was that the design framework provides the measurable guidance for outcomes-based decisions throughout each phase of the program. So the program is until 2022, it's about 5 years. Beginning of 2000, where we're at the moment is stage 2. So we've completed stage 1, which is the indicative business case with the indicative recommended network. And what we're doing now is reevaluating those networks and going into the detailed business cases that will lead to corridor protection and consenting. So the framework itself is, and the principles that form it, which I'll go into a little bit later, is compiled and distilled from various transport guidance documents and policies and plans. And it fits into the strategic context in a way that is quite, I guess, complex. It's how these design processes are devised of numerous inputs and outputs that you can see in the diagram. And it's a reflection of how our cities work. Our cities are these complex social, ecological, technological systems where there's numerous participants and processes which interact often across geographic, institutional and governance scales. So a lot of these kind of inputs and outcomes feed into what these implementation mechanisms could be and what our future form and the transport land use projects are. I guess the key to a systems-based approach that we've taken is it offers a way to understand and look at these interconnections, and it provides an opportunity for holistic thinking. So they're made up of the environment, the social, the built form, the movement, and land use. And that's quite a simple way of breaking down these components, because whilst they're simple, they're still very interactive in nature, and there's a lot of interdependencies that contribute to the health and well-being of the system as a whole. And importantly, we still have to take it into account the cultural values that are inherent and goes along all of those, I guess, components. So under each of those headings, we came up with a number of principles, basically through the lens of the Supporting Growth program. These principles are confirmed for each of the systems layers. So there's environment, built form, social, movement, land use, and you can sort of see most of them are pretty simple, self-explanatory, and really key to, I guess, good design. Things to do with conserving and minimizing the waste and sustainability values, climate change, to do with interfaces between place and movement, social aspects like being safe, respecting cultural identities, corridors that are adaptive. Movement is clearly a big part. So there's a number of key principles about prioritizing active modes and public transport, connecting nodes, employment and industry, connecting to those, and having really legible corridor functions. So these are used as a framework for looking at urban growth areas and how they can be looked at simultaneously and in relationship to each other. And in this way, the transport networks are not seen in isolation, but contribute to the urban system as a whole. And so I guess the next step is to explain how we've actually applied those principles. It's all great having them, but how do we actually use them? So in the beginning of 2019, we started stage 2 of the Alliance. We split it into project teams, and we broke down the growth areas and the networks, the 4 main growth areas, into over 70 projects. So a detailed business case for each project. So that's over 70 detailed business cases, which will take over the next 5 years to complete. And what we've done is in the route options, we've informed the design and development of the route options at each phase using the principles. So through the optioneering phases, we're taking those principles and we're going, well, is option A or option B, option C better? Because does it actually connect employment areas? Does it respect environmental areas? Does it provide those connectivity? Is there a relationship to town centre? Various things. And then in the option development at a detail stage, we're looking at, is this a preferred option? Does it require modified access? How does it affect land uses on each side? How do we get crossings? Is there alternative access? Do we need to close roads? So those principles then come back in and are inherently applied during the workshops and option development. And again, it also helps to inform the structure planning. So I guess, for example, the structure planning that's been undertaken for Drury and Pukekohe, some of our work has informed that or helped to inform that and has been part of some of the discussions with council. And then lastly, there's a really simplistic, I guess, form or matrix. It's called a measurable design outcomes matrix. And what we've done is we've got the system layers that we had right at the beginning: environment, social, built form, movement, and land use, the principles that come under those. And each preferred option is evaluated through a gap analysis against the principles to understand if ultimately that preferred option, does it support those principles? Is it neutral? Does it not support? Is it potentially not relevant? If in cases there are places where it's neutral or doesn't support, this actually gives us the opportunity to investigate further and look at what those potential opportunities for review and improvement are at a detailed design stage or at a consenting stage. So whilst it's quite a simple form, it actually just gives us an opportunity to go back to the beginning and go, hey, have we covered everything? Does it make sense? Do the principles work? And how good is the design and how does it, I guess, relate to those? And I guess I wanted to end this conversation with everyone with one last slide, which is that, you know, our streets and our places are really a system of parts that are broken down. And, you know, when we look at it, planning and designing and safeguarding our future cities is really multifaceted and a very complex problem, and potentially quite an overwhelming problem with the issues that we're facing right now with climate change and population growth and COVID-19. But if we break it down and we look at it as a system of parts that fit together, then we'll find that it's much easier as a problem to solve, because they're all just these smaller parts that we can tackle one by one. But yeah, so that's pretty much my presentation, and I'll end with a thank you, and any questions, give me a buzz. And I don't know if there will be any questions, but we'll see. Now there's 2 questions. Sorry, I'm just trying to read it. Is the Alliance applying any normative objectives the mode shares environmental footprints that we want Aucklanders movement to have? Yes, there are. So for each detailed business case, there are objectives. There are 3 or 4 key objectives that we are trying to achieve through the entire process, and that sits within the detailed business case. And they're to do with accessibility, to do with urban form, to do with safety. And the other question was, what is the mode of public transport? So depending on what area, so there's the frequent transit network, which is buses, rapid transit buses, and there are rail, there's the rail stations and potentially the four-tracking of the rail in the south. There is the potential light rail network for Kemuhilpai. So a lot of these are still kind of under investigation, but we are looking into them. So it would be a variety of different public transport modes. And one more question, apparently. Can you forecast any change for the transportation industry after the COVID-19? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if I have the right expertise to answer this question. I think that for safety, a lot of people will probably avoid public transport for a while because of the social distancing. But I think in the long run, I think there's an appreciation for the environment and for climate change. And I think there's a massive push for public transport and I guess affordable public transport and going away from private vehicles. There's a massive push for cycling, and I think what you'll see at the moment while we've been in lockdown is that there have been so very little cars. It's been super safe for people to cycle as a recreational thing, and I don't actually cycle. I'm very bad at cycling, but I felt like actually if I did have a bike, I would feel like it would be safe enough to go out and bike around. And I think that there's a massive uptake now in cycling in Auckland in particular, and I think that will continue once we come out of COVID-19, which is a great thing. So I think that's all the questions. I'm just going to introduce Lewis Thorson, who is the Senior Public Transport Planner for MR CAGNY. He won the Best Research Paper on Lossless Planning and VKT for Equitable Outcomes.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Elaine. I'd like to also thank everyone for being in and taking the time, taking a much needed break from your Skype webinars to come join us on this relaxing Teams webinar, and also give me the excuse to dress up in my fancy workplace clothing. So so I'm sure that you're all sitting there thinking, man, I hope this guy is finally going to tell me how many lanes I need to build to make that congestion go away. Well, alas, I have some bad news for you. Yep, our old friend, induced demand. Every time we expand capacity, it just builds right back up. So how does this happen? Well, induced demand tends to quickly erode travel time benefits from any roadway capacity expansions. That it's kind of through a couple of different mechanisms. The first being diverted traffic, which doesn't imply any increase in vehicle kilometers traveled overall, but people will shift their travel time from off-peak to peak to take advantage of the expanded road, change their route to go on the new route, but not a longer distance trip. Also, people change their destination to one that's equally far away, but uses that new route. However, more insidious is the other method to induce travel, which implies an increasing network-wide VKT, vehicle kilometers traveled. So this happens through shifting mode from PT, walking and cycling, to driving. People driving further than they would have, for example, by moving to a place that's further away from their workplace, or going to another destination that's farther away. And one of the problems with moving further away is that when that congestion builds back up, now they're kind of locked into a longer congestion-filled commute. Otherwise, taking a longer route to use the new capacity, or else just taking new vehicle trips altogether. These kind of vehicle trips, it's a little faster now, I might as well take it. So these kind of vehicle trips tend to be valued quite low by the people who take them, because after all, these were the trips that were, as soon as the congestion goes back up, they're the first to go. And people just, wouldn't bother with a little bit worse congestion, but since it's got a little better, might as well take it. But what's the big deal with all this? So, what's a couple million extra kilometers of driving among friends, right? Well, I think we're all pretty well aware of some of the impacts of driving, and really increasing vehicle kilometers traveled. It leads to some of these impacts, like traffic deaths and serious injuries. It's a massive public health issue, as well as and that's something that we've seen over the past few weeks, that kind of a reduction in the amount of DSIs compared to average over previous years, about 16 or so, I think it was. And then we have increased GHG and pollutant and other pollutant emissions, reduced physical activities, which also leads to public health issues. And then some research has found that has seen a correlation between the mental health outcomes of people in cities that have a high per capita VKT, vehicle kilometers traveled, is that they tend to have poor mental health outcomes. Aside from that, there are impacts from the road capacity projects themselves. So, for example, we have new barriers to non-car modes being put into place with some of these projects. So, for example, you widen the streets, makes it a lot more difficult for people to cross, and also more dangerous. More continuous traffic flow, and this can happen through expanding capacity upstream with more lanes, while high capacity roundabouts or slip lanes leads to fewer gaps for people to cross further downstream, which, coupled with, if you widen the street as well, then it just makes that even harder to cross, and people might not walk anymore, or take dangerous risks to get across the street. Expanding capacity at intersections can sometimes bus stops away, which reduces the efficiency of the network by reducing the walking catchment of those bus stops. And then the increased traffic that is induced from these capacity expansions, that doesn't end at the edge of the scope of the project. It flows on to the rest of the network, and so we have impacts to public transport, walking and cycling, and other places, also road congestion. And how does this relate to equity? What we see, when we're looking at a road capacity expansion, we see that the benefits of those capacity expansions, they go to people who are generally go to people who are driving already, and people who have a lot of access to a car. And so these people tend to be, a wealthier segment of the population. And so the benefits of the capacity projects are going disproportionately towards more wealthy segment of the population, whereas the negative externalities often fall on lower income communities, as well as people who are unable to drive either because of age or ability, and they aren't able to take advantage of the benefits. So given all this, why do we keep building roads for cars and housing for cars and developments that lead to cars? Well, it's easy for us as planners and engineers to say, yeah, we need to get more mixed-use development with some great streets, walking and cycling, some PT. Yeah, how about some sweet rain gardens to put? But what happens when you try to put the pen to paper and try to get some of these things built and get it on the ground? Right. So yeah, we end up seeing delay to the existing network, and we end up having to mitigate that, and that starts to have to pull back some of the solutions that we're trying to put in place. So knowing what we need to do is only the first step. The systemic change is required for true transformation to be realized. We've gotten so good at measuring traffic delay that it's the primary focus. And we keep getting caught up on mitigating or preventing delay to general traffic, which of course leads to increasing capacity, which leads to more driving and less PT, walking and cycling, which of course leads to, not again. But it's the driving. When we look at delay for motor vehicles as the primary impact of a development, transport project, or any other activity, when in fact it is the additional driving that is the impact of that activity. You can mitigate congestion until the cows come home, but you only have to look at America to see what that gets you. So what's the solution? Well, I propose that we follow the lead of California, where legislation is kicking in this year that requires planners to use vehicle miles traveled as a metric of environmental impacts, rather than the general traffic level of service or delay. Of course, we can use the superior vehicle kilometers traveled, though. But what would a vehicle kilometers traveled based assessment metric mean for development? So let's take a look at a comparison of infill and greenfield developments using the level of service. So you'll have, with an infill development, you have relatively little vehicle travel loaded onto the network, but you see a lot of level of service impacts. Whereas looking at a greenfield development, you tend to have much higher vehicle travel loaded onto the network relative to the infill development, but few actual level of service impacts. The traffic that's generated by these sorts of projects tends to be dispersed enough by the time it reaches those congested areas that it doesn't really trigger the thresholds that are cause mitigations to be required. But the traffic is there and built up and combined with all the other developments, adds much more congestion. And then you have the issue of people, once that congestion does build up in those greenfield developments, there aren't alternatives. They're stuck with the congestion and can't get out of it. Whereas in the infill area, you have much more opportunities to escape the congestion. Using a VKT, metric will help favor mixed-use infill developments and developments that increase housing choice, provide lower cost housing typologies, reduce transport costs, and per capita infrastructure. All this comes together to provide a more equitable housing and services delivery. Lee and Hendy in 2018 reviewed 3 different developments in Davis, California that had been assessed using general traffic level of service and compared what an assessment using VKT would look. They found in comparison to the VKT metric, the level of service metric required several large and expensive roadway capacity mitigations. These are sort of mitigations that further encourage driving in Davis and also erected more barriers to PT, walking, and cycling. What the possible outcomes for the developer would, getting faced with these large, expensive mitigations, means that they might reduce the number of units that they sell to try to sneak below the trigger for those mitigations. They might otherwise pass on the price to the customers and raise the price of the housing that they're housing or commercial or whatever they're developing, or they might just abandon the project altogether and pencil out, now we have this undeveloped area. So using the VKT, rather than trying to increase the traffic flow rate with a level of service metric, and which increases capacity and traffic volumes, which kind of creates that positive feedback loop, and with reduced traffic flow, more congestion, and more calls for mitigations, VKT would favor mitigation measures that improve transport mode choice to PT access and service and safer walking and cycling environments, perhaps reducing parking by replacing a large car park with housing, or and reducing transport-related related pollution and noise. And these sort of mitigations will lead to greater access overall and lower traffic volumes per capita. So how would we do this? There are a lot of different ways that we could use this metric, but one possibility would be to have a baseline VKT and use a sort of trip VKT generation manual, similar to how we do the trip generation. And we create this baseline VKT. We have a lot of data of how different typologies and different locations of developments lead to the amount of driving that's done. We take the VKT and you adjust it baseline and adjust it based on whether it's single use or mixed use, infield, access to the networks, and parking availabilities. I go into a lot more detail in how this could work in my paper, which is on the conference website, but it doesn't have to be too complicated. We can build on it as we go. We always have this tendency to try to get everything exactly right. Trust me, I was an engineer before I was working as a planner, so I know the drive to get all the details down to the third decimal, and that's important. But for this case, start with simplicity and build on it. I can assure you, we can do better than this from the old generation manual. I know this one's a bit out, but shows that. What I want to point out here, though, is that this would not preclude capacity projects. So, we're a growing city. There will be needs for expanding road capacity. That will always happen, and that's not to say we shouldn't ever do that. However, the benefits of doing those would need to be assessed against what sort of impacts reduced traffic would have, and this would help prioritize, the most important, capacity expansion projects to keep the city ticking. In conclusion, I left this slide blank, not just because I wrote my presentation, like a year before I gave it, but also because we are the inspirational city in New Zealand. With the bones are there, the will is there, the policy is changing. So let's take it to the next level. Thank you. If you'd like to see more detail, the paper is on the website, and I'm also welcome to flick me an email if you'd like to discuss further offline. And during the questions, I'll leave these additional resources that are related to the research, and I'll take some questions. Let's see. Thanks. Yes, I like my shirt too. Wondering how, support what you're saying. However, wondering how VKT takes into account the time-dependent effect of pollution. A car can travel only 1 kilometer, but if it took 1 hour to crawl that distance, its impact is relatively significant. Yeah, that's true. I think the point is to reduce the amount of driving that's happening, and understanding that captures a much greater portion of the externalities that would be caused. Like no metric is going to be perfectly able to capture everything, you know, in a complete manner. And I think this is just provides a better way of addressing the root of the problems. So I think it might be also implying that if we don't reduce the delay, or address the delay, then we would be potentially increasing congestion, which would cause more of the pollution. And that kind of makes sense at the beginning, but over time, because of the fact that the expansion has been well documented to be, you know, roadway capacity expansions tend to lead to more driving overall, and the congestion comes back. It doesn't have as much of an impact on actually reducing that congestion-related pollution as it seems like it should. And there's also been research that shows that some of the that a large portion of the pollution-related or the congestion-related pollution reductions that are sometimes accounted for or taken into account when doing the BCR of projects actually is taken up by the delays that are caused by the works of, you know, when they're building the project. So it's like I don't remember how much it was, but it was quite a large percentage that they found that they modeled to actually be like increased pollution because of the additional congestion that happens during the works when you're trying to expand capacity. And so that takes away a lot of the benefits. And those benefits only last for a brief period. What are your thoughts on innovative ways to reduce pedestrian delay at traffic signals, such as automatically adjusting the signal to give more time based on walking speed? Yeah, I think that's great. That would be something that would be an important part of, you know, of mitigations. If you're developing a project or you're doing some sort of project and you say you have mitigations that you need to do, that could be part of it. I think there's, you know, a lot of benefit to getting to improving pedestrian delay at traffic signals, and that can help, just help make that a much more viable option for getting around. If adding a lane just creates more traffic, then surely removing a lane means less traffic. Yes, actually it does. I mean, that's been shown time and again where when infrastructure is removed, it doesn't cause this chaos everywhere. It just goes away. Obviously, there's so much that you can only take that so far, right? So can't go full SimCity 1.0 on, and you know, where you just get rid of the car traffic problems by tearing out all the roads and putting in trains. You know, we need roads for people to get around. There has to be car access. There's no way that shouldn't be done. But yeah, there can be benefits to removing infrastructure. I mean, you've seen it, you know, Fifth Avenue, New York, the Embarcadero Expressway, and San Francisco, the Park East in Milwaukee, the waterfront in Portland, Seattle bridge when it collapsed, also the I-35 in Minneapolis when it collapsed. So as long as people have the information that it's happening, it tends to not affect the network as much. And sometimes it can make it better if you look at Bray's paradox, where, you know, removing a link from a network can sometimes create an overall better outcome for people because of how what the Nash equilibrium is. When people get to an equilibrium, it sometimes can be worse. Too many options. Do we have any more questions? Okay. So we have a question for everyone. From attending the conference and having the option to change anything, what could a perfectly equitable future transport system look like for Christchurch? That's a pretty massive question. I guess I tend to avoid making, trying to make very, like coming up with utopic ideas for how things should look completely to fix everything, because we're working with the system that we have, and that's you know, there are always unintended outcomes from changing anything. And so I think it's more useful to look at how we can make incremental changes on specific things and see how they work with things, you know. And I don't mean to move slowly. You know, they can go quickly, but making incremental changes in lots of different places. You know, there are tons of places that can be done. You know, as far as providing better access to transport, providing, you know, improving crossings, improving, you know, access for people who don't have cars, and, you know, to be able to walk and cross the streets. I think from a standpoint of someone who moved here a few years ago, one thing that stands out is having pedestrians having to give way to cars turning off of the main street is really odd to me and kind of scary. It makes walking very difficult. And then also, like, for some reason, at least in Auckland, the streets seem to be, so I live in Auckland, so I have much better understanding. My understanding of Christchurch, but the flow of traffic is just very continuous. So I've hand this over to someone else. Oh, I'm not sure what that hand signal is. Oh, more questions. Okay. Many councils have requirements for minimum number of parking spaces per dwelling. How can we reduce the number of vehicle movements generated from our developments while still meeting the council requirement? I think that's something that, you know, would have to be tied in with, at least my proposal for the VKT aspect is, you know, aligning some of the other requirements for that, you know, other requirements that are on top of the developments. And it would be unreasonable to say, like, if there's a requirement that is kind of leading to increasing VKT, then it's not reasonable or fair to kind of penalize the developer for meeting the requirements. But that would be something that could be addressed, you know, it's outside of this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be done before VKT could be used as the assessment method. There must be quite a few incentives taken to local and central government that encourage officials to do level of service when dealing with development and developers. How hard would it be to change these to VKT instead? Surely they'd be into it. Maybe. I think, you know, part of it is getting road capacity improvements, you know, paid for by developers is pretty beneficial, but also it's a relatively simple way to assess developments, and so doing something else might be harder. The way it's done, the framework for doing it would have to be developed, and, you know, I think on a national level to provide that guidance to council so they don't have to, you know, reinvent everything themselves if they don't want to. I'd like to hand it over to, if anybody has any other questions for any of the other presenters, because I've had, kind of being at the end, I have the benefit of, seem to have the benefit of having a little more time for questions. All right.
We have a couple minutes left, Jeanette, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just noticed the question asked earlier had quite a lot of thumbs up about just how we think about how we fund transport, and, you know, we don't really consider fuel taxes like alcohol taxes or cigarette taxes as sin taxes, and I think that's kind of exactly right. In terms of, like, what can we do to make things more equitable, I sort of echo Lewis's sentiment around, you know, there's no sort of silver bullet or grand utopian answer. You know, equity is a spectrum, not an absolute. Something can be more or less equitable, and I think, you know, I guess what we've talked about today, you know, there are lots of instances where we can move in a particular direction, whether it's like long-term strategic planning and spatial planning to make sure that, you know, future generations have a place to live that's affordable and accessible, or, you know, whether we don't sort of have these perverse incentives around how we measure success in VKT, or how we don't just keep taking fuel taxes to fund more roads that then require more driving, which produce more fuel taxes and that sort of thing. So I think that's something really, I think a helpful way to frame the discussion. I think equity is a very helpful way to frame transport discussions.
Is there a system of including stakeholder interaction to get inputs for the affected communities? I'm not sure if is that a question. If that's a question for me, then I think, yeah. So this isn't something that I've developed to a handoff, framework for how to do this. This is kind of a higher level plan idea, that concept that has a lot built into how it can be done, but then the way it's delivered would need to be developed. And I think it can be developed used within what we do, the way we do things now, and or that could be changed. But it's primarily just a metric of how we measure what the impacts of the development are. So the stakeholder interaction doesn't have to change. It's just a matter of what they're talking about, and we'll still hear from stakeholders saying that, hey, it's going to cause congestion, you need to fix that, and that can and if that's decided to be what you want to do with mitigations, then that's okay. But looking first at the VKT can help deliver much better outcomes. Yeah, so I see this model being challenged by developers if development contributions are related to VKT. For example, supermarkets may have to pay more, as we know, but as we know, they're an essential service. Any thoughts on how you would validate the VKT fairly? Yeah, I think, well, part of it is building it, is comparing types of developments to other possibly similar developments. So there are some things like, food delivery. These things are going to be essential, right? But there are that's part of doing business. So right now they already have to do large amounts of mitigations in order to address their congestion impact. And so I think it would primarily in the case of a supermarket where you don't have much, they're not going to change that much. It will change what types of mitigations they would have to deliver, and oftentimes those might be cheaper than providing an excellent bicycle network, or improvement and things like this is much cheaper than widening an intersection or building a new on-ramp or putting in a traffic signal. So they might benefit overall. It's hard to say. I'd have to see how it works out, but it would probably also make it easier for people to build smaller local markets that people can walk to, people can cycle to, that will serve a more local community. Nick had a question, but he answered that. So I don't know. Does anybody else want to answer the Christchurch question? Okay.
Nick, did you want to make a comment about Christchurch? You're in that great position that you're actually leaving town soon, so you can speak openly.
Well, hopefully leaving town soon.
Yeah.
I was supposed to be in Canada by now. Yeah, maybe just echoing something I said before about, a more equitable outcome is something that we can continually work towards. It's probably something that we'll never get to. And I think there's a real challenge too, because you can't wholly and solely solve social equity issues with transport programs. I mean, they can cause a lot of problems, and they can help. They are, you know, a big part of the solution. But redistributing welfare for, you know, people that suffer at the hands of congestion, or, you know, being pushed to affordable housing on the periphery of the city because you know, poor land use outcomes and that sort of thing. These are all equity issues, and you know, what we've talked about, I think, today around funding and, you know, why and how we build, you know, and appraise transport projects. You know, how we plan long term for land use. I mean, those are all ways of helping and addressing it. So, you know, I think there's sort of lessons across all the talks today about how to, you know, improve equity through transportation and planning. So that's what I'll say about that. So it's quite a political answer.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. We've just gone 5 minutes over the hour, so hopefully we've still got a few people on the webinar. Thanks so much for attending. This has shown a great level of interest. What we'll look at doing is putting those question and answers together into a compilation, and we'll send those out to all the people that registered for the webinar. As I mentioned at the start, we do have another one lined up from the conference, and I think after seeing how many people were interested in today's session, we will run that. I've actually had another idea as we've been talking today around the question Gemma asked about how's COVID-19 going to affect the transport industry or transport in our communities, and I actually think that's another great topic that we should look to hold a webinar for and get some thought pieces going, and a bit of a panel maybe around what we've all observed and how we can take the transport benefits that have come out of it and move those forward with us into business as usual. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Keep safe.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you all.
Thanks.